What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Clearly, I'm not in my usual setup right now. I am on vacation, but imagine thinking we're gonna skip out on a player breakdown Thursday video. That's not gonna happen, so we absolutely need to be making this video right now. I apologize if the lighting's not fantastic, if you hear lops in the background maybe, but the show must go on. We're gonna do this breakdown, and I think it's a really good one because you guys have been suggesting, do Kyler versus Allen versus Dak, do Lamar versus Dak versus Allen, like all these different combinations. And honestly, I've been sitting here with my rankings being like, yeah, I want someone from this group, but I think I have a preference, but I don't really know how to break them down. And so I think whenever that happens, it turns out to be a really good breakdown video because it's definitely not obvious how you have these four. And even after doing this breakdown, if you wanted to argue a different direction, I'm not totally against it. And we're definitely going to go over that at the end of it. But today we're doing Dak, Lamar, Kyler, Josh Allen, breaking down that 2 through 5 quarterback spot because I do have Patrick Mahomes at the 1 spot. Usually I only do 3 players because it gets really long when I do 4, but I didn't know who to kick out, right? I really think this is a really solid group, a really good tier 2 group of quarterbacks, and so I think we need to break down every single one of them, which of course we will do in a second. But first, we got to start things off as usual, the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat was supposed to be that Derrick Henry and Dalvin Cook led the league in rushing yardage through the first 8 games last season, who was third. Unfortunately, Dare slipped up just one word and said the final 8 weeks. Instead, that's probably why you guys were confused. So I'll switch the stat to that, the final 8 weeks. The answer for that is Jonathan Taylor. And so the first people to get that right were Tristan Searcy on YouTube and at Nate Trotter 4 on Twitter. Today's stat: who was the youngest running back last season to have a rushing touchdown? So like when they scored the rushing touchdown, who had a rushing touchdown when they were the youngest last year? Okay, so 4 players this week. I don't want to make this like a 45-minute video and do the normal setup where we individually break down every single one. So I thought it would be fun to look at a few different categories, see how they stack up against each other, and then go in one by one and kind of assemble these rankings. So you'll understand what I mean when we finally do it, but the categories we're going to kind of go over first are their weapon quality, so like how good are their skill players, how much do we trust their offense, the passing upside of the quarterback, and then the rushing upside, and then like overall projections, how they stack up when you compare all of these things. So again, it'll all make sense once we go through it. So first up, we will talk about the weapon quality of each of these teams. And I think it's fairly obvious that we have to name the Cowboys the winners here, right? I mean, you've got Cooper, Lamb, Gallup. I don't want to say it's the best trio in the league because then people get all defensive about their favorite team, but it's basically as good of a trio as you can hope for, right? It is an elite trio. We went over in a video last week, I believe, about how Gallup is honestly underrated. He is a fantastic receiver. He could be the X receiver on a ton of different teams. Just so happens that they have Lamb, they have Cooper. Like, they're a fantastic offense. And when you compare that with a quality ground game, Zeke, Tony Pollard, that's a great complement to the passing game. And since they also still have a fairly mediocre defense, I mean, they're going to be forced to use that offense. You just have to think, if we're looking at the weapons surrounding each of these quarterbacks, Dallas has the best weapons. After Dallas, I think it is a lot closer, but I'm going to give a slight edge to the Buffalo Bills. Both Diggs and Hopkins are absolutely elite wide receivers. I think it's a wash. Maybe you can argue one over the other, but they're both fantastic, great receivers. Like, I don't want to say one has an edge there. But after that, I think that Emmanuel Sanders and Gabriel Davis is a better combination than AJ Green and Rondell Moore / Christian Kirk. And I guess you could throw Kirk in there with Green as well because I don't totally know how it's going to shake up. But I think that like Green can be good, Kirk can be good, and I'm excited about Moore in the future. But I think that like Right now, Emmanuel Sanders is better than Kirk and Green, and I think that Moore is still like he's extremely young. I think again he's gonna have a great career. I just don't think it's like this season is when he's truly breaking out and providing a ton for the offense. Then there's also, the team surrounding these players, right? I mean, the Bills are an extremely smart organization. They are willing to use analytics to benefit the offense. So I personally just have a little bit more faith in the Bills and knowing that they're going to run an offense that will maximize the talent of Josh Allen. And it's just a little more confidence than I have that the Cardinals will maximize Kyler. That is not to say the Cardinals are trash. I think they're still a good organization. I still think that Kyler is going to be fantastic. But if I'm looking at these two teams and I'm saying which team is going to get the most out of their quarterback, Josh Allen or Kyler Murray, I think the Bills get more out of Josh Allen than the Cardinals get out of Kyler. Last place here, and basically I'm saying they're very, very close, and I'm barely putting Josh Allen over Kyler Murray there. And so last place on our list is going to be the Ravens. I do think that trio of Brown, Andrews, and then like one of Bateman or Watkins, kind of whoever wins that role. I think maybe Watkins starts out, but that Bateman takes over. I think that is last among these four teams. I do believe that Bateman has, elite upside. I think he can be an X receiver, really, really good receiver at some point. I just don't think that this is the season. It's kind of like with Rondell Moore. I don't think this is the season where Bateman maximizes his potential. I think he can be good. I think maybe down the stretch he can be someone we look at in fantasy, but I don't think he's like elevating the offense this season. Maybe next season, maybe the year after that. But for this year, I think you're asking a lot for him to do that. And since the Ravens are lacking a true number one, they clearly have less overall talent than Dallas. I'm going to rank them last in weapon quality for the quarterback. Next up, we're going to look at passing upside, which of course is like tied to weapon quality, since the more weapons you have, the easier it is to have higher end passing production. I think everyone can agree that Lamar has the least passing upside of these four. He won the MVP with 208 passing yards per game. He was down to 183 per game last season. So something would have to go seriously wrong for one of like Josh, Kyler, Dak to be that low, right? Lamar is ranked last in passing. And honestly, I think first place has to go to Dak here as well. He's averaged 322 passing yards per game these last two seasons, and nothing has changed to make me think that that's going to be different, right? If anything, Lamb is going to be even better this season, utilized even more, which will only make them more efficient through the air. Second and third place, again, comes down to Josh and Kyler. And Josh has a slight leg up here. Vegas has the over-under at like 400 passing yards as a difference, and he did throw for 36 more passing yards per game last season. To me, after looking at the weapons and the expected passing production, I do think that the ranking here, if we're looking at just pure passing, is pretty clear. Dak is leading this group. Josh Allen is a close-ish second. I do think it's a pretty significant gap between Dak and Josh Allen. Then a very small bump down to Kyler, and then Lamar is last by a good amount. Now, with most quarterbacks, that'd be the end of this breakdown. That's exactly how we would, have these rankings. But we're not doing this breakdown because of that passing, right? These four are such incredible picks because they have that combination of passing and rushing. Every one of these quarterbacks has mobility, with all but Dak, I would say, being extremely mobile, even getting, designed quarterback runs. So I think it's really important that we go over how we would rank them in terms of rushing. Yet again, first and last is pretty clear. No quarterback has more rushing upside than Lamar Jackson, and Dak just isn't as mobile as the other two. I do think it's important to not just like stop there with Lamar though and say, well, yeah, he's first and move on, because there's such a gap between his passing and everyone else's that I think people will just write him off because, I just say, oh, he wins in rushing, but he's crushed in the other spot. And it's like, oh, okay, he gets last. Well, no, I mean, rushing production is such a cheat code in fantasy, we got to go over it, right? I mean, in his MVP 2019 season, Lamar averaged 80 rushing yards per game with 7 rushing touchdowns, which is an extra 10.6 fantasy points per game just from rushing. That is incredible, and there really is no other quarterback that can match that. We'll go over how Kyler's close, but no other quarterback realistically can match the same ceiling that Lamar Jackson has in rushing. And the thing is, he didn't reach the ceiling. So I think people assume like, oh, that was best case scenario, right, in 2019. But remember what we talked about last season. I mean, they did crush a few teams, and so he didn't play in the fourth quarter a few times in that season. And the 7 rushing touchdowns, I mean, on 179 attempts, that's not crazy high, right? He could have had 10, 11, 12 rushing touchdowns. So he also could have had a few more rushing yards because, remember I said, they blew out a few teams. And so his ceiling is probably closer to like 85, 90 yards per game, double digit, into 12, 13 touchdowns as a ceiling. So no, he did not reach his ceiling in 2019, which is obviously scary to think about. And I mean, when you consider they add Bateman, they add Watkins, the passing numbers could expand. He could do better than 2019, where he had 27.7 fantasy points per game, which by itself was definitely more than Dak had in his insane 5-game stretch last season, which we thought was unsustainable at the time. I just wanted to point that out because, again, I think people are a little bit down on Lamar this season after what happened last year. But even then, he averaged 22.2 fantasy points per game, which is still elite production. So after Lamar, at the top of mobility, we do have Kyler in second. He averaged 51 rushing yards per game last season to go along with 11 rushing touchdowns, which came out to 9.2 rushing fantasy points per game. I would say that he fell in the high end of variance in rushing touchdowns. You probably shouldn't expect very many more than 11 rushing touchdowns. That's a lot. But, some of those, maybe they turned to passing touchdowns. So he goes down to 8, but he gains 3 passing touchdowns, and it's only like he lost 1 touchdown. So it's not like a huge thing where it's like, oh my goodness, look at all this regression coming. But I would say 11 rushing touchdowns is probably overly optimistic. He's not Lamar Jackson, but like 9.2 fantasy points per game is insane to add with your legs, especially since he was on pace for over 4,200 passing yards before hurting his shoulder in week 11. Prior to that injury, he was averaging 264 passing yards per game, 67 rushing yards per game, and 30.1 fantasy points per game. After getting hurt early in week 11, though, he averaged 34 fewer passing yards per game, 32.6 fewer rushing yards per game, and dropped down to 17.05 fantasy points per game. So he went from having an historic season in fantasy, then he hurts his shoulder, and now he's a high-end quarterback too after the injury. I think that is so important to understand. It wasn't just the drop of 34 passing yards per game. It was the fact that the Cardinals tried to actively limit how many hits he took, and the easiest way to do that is to say, hey, you cannot scramble. You will not be running in the red zone. We will be handing the ball off. You will not be getting design runs. And that's what happened. Before getting hurt, Kyler had 19 red zone carries across the first 9 weeks. After getting hurt, he had 5 red zone carries across the final 7 weeks. So we already knew how he went for fewer passing yards, fewer rushing yards, but this isn't just like looking back, right? It's not like I just picked a random week and was like, oh, look at this. From this week on, he was worse. Because if you do that, you can run into schedule issues, you can run into variance. But at the time, during last season, this was a narrative. This was something we were looking at and like, no, he's clearly not being used as a mobile quarterback as much because they don't want him to get hit. It was very clear at the time. And so when we look back and we evaluate his season before the injury and after the injury, it makes sense that he saw this lack of production because he wasn't as good of a passer. He wasn't running as much. So he wasn't getting rushing yardage, the rushing touchdowns. Like, it's very, very clearly not something we're just looking at and randomly picking a week. It's something that actually happened to him. And if he's going to be healthy this season, does he go back to 30 fantasy points per game? Maybe. He has that sort of upside. So Kyler is the only quarterback that can actually rival Lamar Jackson in rushing production this season. And he has, a good amount more upside through the air because of the offense he's on and the weapons that he has. After Kyler, it's pretty clearly Josh Allen. Allen has between 26 and 32 rushing yards per game these last 2 years, while Dak has been around 17 or 18 yards per game. Allen has scored also far more rushing touchdowns because, I mean, watch that offense, right? Like you have Dallas, and it's like, yeah, they're going to run the ball with Zeke when they get close a lot. But you watch Buffalo, like how many times has Josh Allen stolen a rushing touchdown from Singletary or Zach Moss, right? So he gets a lot of rushing touchdowns. So even if the gap isn't like massive, right? It's maybe like a little more than 10 rushing yards per game, it's those touchdowns, and that's going to be sustainable. We talk about touchdowns being random. It's not random with Josh Allen because that's how they run their offense. It's through Josh Allen. They don't have an Ezekiel Elliott that they keep pounding in when they get close. In terms of expected points breakdown, this is basically how the difference is looking in terms of rushing production. Lamar is projected for around 8 points per game, Kyler for around 7, Josh Allen around 5.5, and Dak around 3.5. Those numbers are naturally a little bit low because they bake in the potential to miss time. But in general, you're going to see Lamar at the top, drop down about 1 point per game and get to Kyler, drop down about a point and a half per game from Kyler to Josh Allen, and then from Josh Allen to Dak is about 2 points per game. So that's kind of how the difference is, no matter if you want to bake in injuries, you don't want to bake in injuries, if you want to project it out, like they're all going to move up the exact same. So a pretty big drop down for Dak. But again, we said he wins fairly easily in passing production. So the question becomes, can Dak Prescott make up for that drop in rushing volume with his passing? So can he gain 2 points per game over Allen, 3.5 points per game over Kyler, and 4.5 points per game over Lamar Jackson? Because if he can't do that, well, then he's last in this group. Here's what I've come up with personally to answer that question. And again, if you have a different answer to this question, then you have a different ranking, right? But my answer is that I absolutely think he can, but it's not going to be easy, and it's probably not worth taking the risk, right? It probably doesn't make it worth drafting him ahead of these guys because he's coming off 2 major surgeries. We have seen that players have a positive outlook, right, during the offseason. It's like everything's good. And then we get news and everyone freaks out, right? I think you know who I'm talking about in recent weeks. So is it possible that in a month we get news that it's like, well, he's doing great, he's just probably not going to scramble as much? Or maybe we just limit a little bit, we try and run the ball a little bit more, what he's doing. You know, we don't have as many plays where we're rolling out, you know, we're trying to hit deep balls with bootlegs. Like, there is a chance that he's limited in certain ways to start the season that we're not thinking of right now. And if he's limited in any way, it's like he probably can't pass these guys. And even if he's not limited, that's the big thing, it's still going to be difficult for him to make up that lack of rushing with the passing. And because of that, because I think it's going to be difficult for him to do that, I am going to rank Dak last. But as we'll go over in the end, still is absolutely a guy I want on my team. After Dak, I'm putting Lamar Jackson at third. I had such a hard time with this one, but for me, it came down to that gap in rushing. If we look at pre-injury Kyler, there really isn't a massive drop in rushing, but there is a drop in passing. You know, Lamar got an upgrade with Bateman, with Watkins, but Kyler, you know, he still has the better supporting cast. That's very clear. He's still on an offense that's going to throw the ball a lot more. I know that rushing production is very, very important in fantasy, but again, the gap is not as big as most people will assume. It's like 1 point per game, and I do think that Kyler will have more than a point per game more than Lamar in passing, and so I'm going to put him behind Kyler. And then when I look at Lamar versus Allen, I thought more about the share of touchdowns. We know a ton about certainty with Josh Allen and that he's going to have such a massive share of the Bills' touchdowns. And since I think the Bills are going to be a fantastic offense, he's going to have a lot of touchdowns for sure. Because Buffalo, like I said, they don't run it as much with their running backs when they get close. They have Josh Allen run the ball in there, and you're like, oh, well, so does Lamar. Right, but there's still going to be plenty of games where like Gus and Dobbins combined for maybe 3, potentially 4 touchdowns among them. That's not going to happen in Buffalo. There's not going to be any games where Singletary and Moss have 4 combined rushing touchdowns and Josh Allen has none, right? So I think because the Ravens are just more willing to use their running backs to just run touchdowns in than Buffalo is, I feel better about the touchdowns for Josh Allen, and so I am going to put Josh Allen ahead, and so Lamar does get third for me. So we have Dak at 4, Lamar at 3. The final 2, it's brutal. It is honestly brutal. I was sitting up late last night like trying to figure this out because it's so difficult. They're so close. They both have incredible upside. They both have insanely high floors. I want both of them on my team. But this is my thought process. Looking at Vegas lines and projections, Josh Allen should have about a point per game advantage in passing yards, but is 1.5 points per game back in rushing, counting both yards and touchdowns. So the question becomes, can Josh Allen score 0.6 more points per game in passing touchdowns, which comes out to about 2.5 touchdowns across a whole season? So basically, if I look at Vegas, I look at projections, when I take out rushing yards, rushing touchdowns, passing yards, and I only leave passing touchdowns, the question becomes, can Josh Allen outscore Kyler Murray by 2.5? Because if he can throw for 3 more touchdowns, then the pick is Josh Allen. And if we look at projections, we look at Vegas lines, and we think about it, I believe the answer is yes. Vegas has the difference at 9, which I personally think is egregious, and I'd be taking you over on Kyler. I think they're undershooting Kyler at 25.5. I think he's going to be better than that. But over time, Josh Allen is still going to score a good chunk more passing touchdowns per game than Kyler. I trust Greg Cosell more than pretty much any other NFL film analyst. I think he is incredible. I think he does a great job breaking things down. And so when he talks up Josh Allen as an incredible quarterback who's making progress, who could end up being the most physically gifted quarterback the league has ever seen, I take note, right? And everything he said about him and his development seems to be accurate. When we look at him, his arm is just incredible. Like the things that Josh Allen can do with his arm are scary. Honestly, he is such a good quarterback. And so when I'm thinking about, what quarterback could post 30 points per game this season, could win the MVP, I think that Josh Allen has the best chance among the players in this group, and I would take him just ahead of Kyler. So that is the ranking. Josh, then Kyler, then Lamar, then Dak. But I want to make a super important note right now. Every single one of these guys could legitimately score 30 points per game, could score 32 points per game, could be the number 1 quarterback, and I absolutely want every single one of them on my team. The 5th round sees a big drop in talent at wide receiver and especially at running back, in the security of the running back position. And there are really no tight ends that I feel great about since the top 4 are probably off the board at that point. So if you can get any of these 4 in the 5th round, do it. I have them ranked as mid 4th round picks. My projections grade them out as 3rd round picks. So getting them in the 4th is honestly a value according to my projections. The 5th, I think, is beautiful. So we went on a stretch where it was absolutely a viable strategy saying that I'm going to stream quarterback because there were a ton of pocket passers and you could pretty easily find a streaming option that relatively matched the high-end production. Maybe you weren't getting, the number 1 quarterback in streaming, but you were getting like mid-range quarterback 1 and that was totally fine. But I believe that time is over because of the edge that these mobile quarterbacks plus Dak have over that quarterback like 10 to 14 range. I just think you're not going to stream 30 points per game at quarterback. You're probably going to stream in that like 17 to maybe 20 points per game, and you're not going to have access to these 40-point weeks. Because it's one thing to say, maybe over time I can get within like 5-6 points per game, but when you stream, you're like, yes, I got 24. When you have these quarterbacks 10 through 14, you're like, awesome, I just got 26. but you're not having Josh Allen and Kyler and Lamar and Dak who could drop 40. And that's how personally I think you win a championship, is when you unlock that sort of weekly ceiling. And so if it's only going to cost you a 5th round pick, again, the round where we see a massive drop off in success rate, I personally think it is such a no-brainer. No matter what you've done in the first 4 rounds, if you can grab one of these 4 quarterbacks in the 5th round, I think you absolutely do it. So that is my order for ranking them. Again, Josh Allen, Kyler Murray, Lamar Jackson, Dak Prescott, and if multiple are available, that's what I'm doing. But I want whatever one is left on the board in my pick in the 5th round. So that is the end of this breakdown. Please remember to put your suggestions in the comment section below for what breakdown you want to see next Thursday, and make sure you scroll through and you upvote the ones that you want to see. I want to make content that you guys want to watch. But that'll do it for this one. I hope you all did enjoy. If you did, then how about hitting that like button, and how about subscribing to the channel if you're new here? Thanks for watching.